Look at that face. So I was just watching a whole bunch of YouTube videos, and I'm getting kind of a sense of what sort of content is out there. And there's a lot of kind of themes, like people seem to do a lot of videos about the same topics. If you're watching paranormal videos, you'll see like maybe 7 channels using the same style. So people do tend to copy one another. And I'm not that different because I started this channel inspired by several YouTubers. There's another YouTuber I want to mention, but I think I'll do a separate video for that, because what I wanted to talk about now was I've noticed that there's a lot of people doing YouTube videos talking about cultural differences, and I noticed that there's a lot of videos kind of enunciating the cultural differences between America and the UK, and also Canada and America. But I have not really seen much done about the difference between, and similarities actually, because there's quite a few, between Canada and the UK, or Canada and England specifically. I visited England a number of times, and I worked a summer there, which doesn't make me an expert, but I find it interesting that it hasn't really been explored, because there's two things. Both Canada and England are often accused of being extremely polite cultures, and also Canada modeled itself after England in a lot of ways. There's a lot of it kind of worships England in a funny sort of way. Canada as a nation never really rebelled against English rule. They didn't fight for independence. They just sort of laid back and waited and got it eventually, which is a very Canadian way of going about things, I think. Anyway, so there are a lot of things that I wanted to address in this video. One was, there's a lot of videos talking about words and vernacular that is different in England from US English. And I noticed that there are some gaps. We've all heard about the difference between a boot and a trunk, and a lift and an elevator. But I noticed that there are some words that are used a lot, that I heard a lot when I was in England, that don't seem to come up that much when people are explaining to Americans about English vernacular. And that is, there are four or five words that I kept hearing again and again and again. The first one is stroppy, which doesn't really have an equivalent. I guess you could say it means sort of cranky, but the connotation of stroppy is sort of somewhere, it's like pissed off, bitchy, and bossy all at the same time in this sort of hybrid word. So stroppy has, and in that sense, I find it kind of onomatopoeic, like it really sounds like what it is. And then you have trendy. Trendy, of course, we use in Canada and also in the States, and we tend to think of it as meaning somehow culturally cutting edge. But what English people mean is, it probably used to mean that in England, but they tend to use it more now just to mean something really expensive and pretentious. And then there's barking mad, which is usually a compliment. When people in England say that, it sounds kind of scary, but usually it's referring to someone who is a bit of a party animal, or excuse me, or is really wild, like fun, and very funny. And one of the misconceptions that Canadians and Americans have about English people is that they're polite. which I have to say I disagree. I don't think that English people are polite. I think that English people are very cheeky. Um, they have this sense of humor which requires them to be sarcastic and take the piss, which is making fun of you, and also do it in an understated way with this sort of gift of understatement, and it's all kind of wrapped in this very complex decorative package and then has a bow on it, so it looks sort of pretty. um, and I noticed when I was there, it took me a while to realize that people were totally taking the piss. And also, there's sometimes when something sounds really nice and it's not. Like, if I generally found that if English people said that they liked something about me, it meant that they didn't like it, and that sometimes they could insult, and that actually was more of a compliment because if they feel relaxed enough to take the piss, then they probably like you or respect you a little bit. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, oh yes, sorry, to address the polite thing. English people, it's not that they're polite, it's that they have a lot of manners. They have layers upon layers upon layers of manners and training, which is not the same as the Canadian brand of politeness, which is where you're born with this sense that your presence on earth is an imposition. And so you're constantly trying to get out of everyone's way. And I mean, I even have that. Like, I remember feeling that way kind of as a child. Like, you know, I'd be on the subway, and if I got too close to someone, my mom would just look at me and be, "Ow." And so you always have this kind of unconscious sense that you have to give people room and give them a lot of space, and don't ask questions that are too forward, don't stare at people. Like, that sort of thing is so ingrained. And whereas I found English people, it was more just they relied on their training, and if it didn't work, they really didn't give a shit. Whereas I feel like Canadians feel it. They feel it like a sense of personal shame if they get in your way or freak you out. They're really scared of making anyone feel embarrassed or awkward or creeped out. So they tend to be very reserved because they don't want to commit to anything that might be uncomfortable. And yes. Oh, and then so the other thing about English people is there is this sort of class system, which is very curious. Basically, you know, you've all heard about posh people, and people talk about the posh thing in England all the time. And one thing that is good to know is that a posh person who is actually posh will never admit to being posh. They will never say, I am posh. They will say, I'm middle class. And if you're Canadian, you're thinking of someone who lives in Etobicoke, which is not what they mean. Like, a middle class person in England has probably never seen aluminum siding. And if you ask them if they're posh, they'll be like, oh no, I never had much money in my life. But when I'm talking about posh, like if I'm asking an English person if they're posh, I'm not asking about how much money their family has. I'm asking if, you know, they can eat peas with their left hand with a fork, and you know, if they have that special way of speaking, which you can observe. You don't need to ask about that. But basically, a posh person kind of has this twist to the mouth, and when they're being sarcastic, they'll tend to like take a drag off a cigarette and then blow it like while saying something quite cutting and sarcastic at the same time. And well, that's my take on the English posh thing, which Canadians don't have at all. I have this theory that reserved nations tend to be people that live in cold climates, it's not completely across the board, because I would say that Scottish people are not that reserved. And but I do think that Russians are reserved. I think that Norwegians take the cake for reserve. I think that Tibetans, like, from the cold mountains of the Himalayas, are reserved. I've noticed that North Indians who live in the mountains are more reserved, definitely, than people on the plains. And I would say that Canadians are a lot more reserved than Americans. Um, and I don't know if that's just because people in colder climates spend more time on their own, or if the ice actually gets into their veins. But but that's my little theory on the matter. And but if you happen to be Canadian and you go to England, you should very quickly reprogram yourself, because if you're being teased in a way that for you in Canada would mean that they are not your friends, in England it probably means that they are your friends, like they like you, and that's why they're giving you a hard time. And and if they, the one word that you want to avoid being called at all costs in England is quaint. If someone calls you quaint, that's the kiss of death, and they don't want anything to do with you. Quaint is not good. Quaint is lame, basically. It sounds nice. Oh, quaint. But it's not. It's definitely an indication that you are as stupid as an Angora rabbit and not worth talking to. So, okay. I'm sure that there will be people that disagree with my characterization of English people, Canadians, and probably Americans also. But that's what makes these videos so fun. Let's open the discussion. Okay, bye for now. I don't know why I wanted to make this video.